Hello and welcome to Unstress. My name is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Now, before I start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I am recording this podcast, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. This week, we are going to gain a little bit of an insight into industry, and in particular two industries. One is the pharmaceutical industry and the other is the vitamin industry, and they have a lot of similarities and they also have a lot of differences. I mean, in terms of resources, the pharmaceutical industry is so well resourced, lobbies so hard on so many different levels that it's perhaps unfair to compare the two, but there are similarities, and I guess the common denominator in all that is that they are part of the healthcare system. Although one might argue that the pharmaceuticals business model is focused more on the management of chronic disease and engaging with as many patients as possible. In fact, if the population were a patient, which arguably we are, then the management of those patients means big sales. And so the pharmaceutical industry works on that model. The vitamin industry works on a slightly different model, and that is based on biochemistry and physiology. Vitamins and minerals are important cofactors in the trillions of biochemical processes that go on in each and every cell in our body from the moment of conception to the moment we die. So the vitamin industry is focused on supporting those biochemical processes. So philosophically, a big difference. One could argue one invested in disease, one invested in maintaining health. But the point is that we are exposed to both industries all the time, whether we like it or not. And so I thought today would be interesting to just gain a little bit of insight into some of the workings at the ground level of how sales are generated and how education is performed in both these industries. Look, it's a snapshot. My guest today is Gill McEwen. Now, Gill has been the Global Director of Education at the Blackmores Institute. Now, most people in Australia might be familiar with the word Blackmores, as it is one of the pioneering companies in vitamin supplementation in Australia, and it is now available throughout Southeast Asia and into China. I had the privilege of working with Gill for the Bioceuticals. Bioceuticals is the practitioner brand of Blackmores. It's a vitamin brand. Bioceuticals holds a national conference every year, and I was asked to MC that conference. I've referenced it before. It was focused on enhancing mental well-being, navigating the modern world. And in our many conversations during our preparation for that conference, I realized that Gill actually had a great deal of experience within the pharmaceutical industry. She goes back a long way and has worked with some of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world. Sanofi, which is a French company, Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer, the name on everyone's lips. So she has insights and shares with us her own experience as she started as a young woman in the early 20s as a sales rep for the pharmaceutical industry, and she gradually got more involved in education and then moved to the vitamin industry and took some of her skills that she learned there to that. She's also worked with the Institute of Company Directors and the Chartered Accountants of Australia and New Zealand. So she has a wealth and depth of knowledge and insights into those industries. And we touched on certain things in sales that I thought were very revealing. I thought possibly one of the most important things she said was, I can't sell anything unless I believe in it. And I truly believe that many people in this industry, whichever side of the industry you're on, truly believe that what they are doing and what they are selling are good for people's health. And there's no question that pharmaceuticals do play a very important role in maintaining people's health. I hope you enjoy this conversation I had with Gill McEwen. Welcome to the show, Gill.
Thank you, Ron. Really, really pleased to be here.
Gill, we worked together on that wonderful conference that you organised, Enhancing Mental Health, and congratulations to you and your team. It was a great program, a real honour for me to be involved in it. And I learnt about your association with so many different parts of this industry, the pharmaceutical industry, two big players there, and corporate world. I wondered if you might just give us a bit of a snapshot, a sort of a potted history of your move through those institutions. I mean, I know it's been very education focused, but tell us about them a bit.
Look, at the young age of 21, I travelled the world and came back and was looking for what would my career really be, because up until then, my focus was leave school, save money, and travel. And, in all honesty, I'll say I hadn't thought about a career. And as an opportunity came and landed in my lap, basically, I'd gone to an agency and the lady said, "Oh, look, I have this role coming up with a pharmaceutical company and they want you, or this role, to organise a conference for 350 delegates from around the world." So it wasn't so much the local people, it was bringing everyone in from Europe, the UK, the US. And I looked at her and said, "What skills do I have for that? Given that all I've done is travel the world." And she said, "You have every skill that you require. You have been able to plan where you've traveled, deal with the challenges while you've been traveling. You really have all those frameworks that you need to sit down and project plan what you need to do with the conference." And look, you've got a lot of confidence back at that age. So I just took a leap of faith at that time and thought, you know what, I can do this. So my first job was with actually Roussel UCLAF, which is now, I think, Sanofi Aventis.
Ah, right, yes.
So I spent probably the first 6 months of my time organising that conference. I learnt a lot, was able to draw on my French from school, which wasn't that great at school, but became very proficient at it when I was working with the person who'd come across from France to help me. It was a successful conference for us. And then I was asked to help organise a global leaders meeting for Roussel UCLAF, bringing in all of their CEOs from every country in which they played. And that was for a week. And that was a kind of a different project, but really drew again on all of the skills that you require in organising an event, which ultimately led to one of the delegates who came there was relocating from France into Australia, and he asked me if I would be his EA. And I thought, oh, why not? So I actually spent about a year and a half in that role, learnt a lot. He conversed nearly every day in French. I can remember the telexes. I think it's the telexes and
Yeah.
typing on those. That takes you back so far, but shows how far we've come
Mm,
as well.
mm.
And then moved into a rep role. So something, I guess, back then at the age of 22, not having done a science degree, not having a background at all in that area, I was very unique and really was given the opportunity because of the skills and the knowledge and I guess the work ethic that I had displayed during my time with Roussel UCLAF. And they said, look, if you get through the 6 week induction, you've got the job. And I guess really you could say the rest is history. So I stayed in the rep role for 6 months, and then at the time I was married and my husband got a transfer with his role up to Port Macquarie. So I had to go in and say, oh, I'm sorry, I need to leave. I'm moving. And they actually gave me the first, what you would call um, country role. So I lived in Port Macquarie, but still repped across, calling on all the different specialists, pharmacists, and was able to promote the products that we had from, I think it was Newcastle to Tweed Heads out to Moree. So that gave me a flavour of what it was like to talk about and discuss and go through the clinical trials that we had for not just our day-to-day products, but also some products that were used in surgery that were quite cutting edge at that time, and taking them from what was typically in the core hospitals in Sydney, but expanding out the market into the country hospitals. I stayed in that role for 2 years and then relocated to Sydney, and I've probably spent, I'd say, 38 years in total going around the different, or some of the key pharma companies, like you were saying. So
Hmm.
primarily Johnson and Johnson and Pfizer would be the two that everybody knows these days. But I transferred into more of the over the counter side of the business, as opposed to where I'd started, which was more calling on GPs and their specialists, as I said. And the reason I went across to that side was, intrinsically, there's a salesperson in me. I have to believe in the product, and I won't sell something if I don't believe in it. But I also wanted that immediate satisfaction. And when you're calling on GPs or hospitals, it's a long, slow burn. If you want to get a drug onto the formulary in the hospital, which is a good thing, you need to be able to compile all of your evidence, put business cases forward to the chief pharmacists and other key people in the decision-making committees before they actually take that drug on board. And look, sometimes that can take 6 months, sometimes that can take 18 months. And I needed that immediacy in terms of feeling satisfied about what I was out to achieve.
And when you were a rep, how often would you say drop in on a doctor, a particular doctor? I mean, it takes 6 months or 18 months to get traction in a practice. What typically would be your visits?
From a country perspective, what I learnt was you could actually call on them nearly every month. But I will flag for those who are listening now who are in the industry, it is very different now to what it was then.
Right.
Um, Back then, you could have, even in one company, I can remember at Pfizer, we had 6 reps calling on one territory. They might have had different products, but the priorities of the products were separate for each team. Whereas I'm talking many, many years ago, and there wasn't as many reps. And while they had calendars, and they'd say, oh, you can call on us 3 times a year, and everyone would madly run around in July every year to get their bookings for the next year. As you built up your portfolio and profile with a doctor, it actually became a lot easier to call in. And you had to make yourself relevant.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the biggest thing I can remember back then was a lot of reps just thought, oh, this is a sample drop. I'll call in, see if I can grab the doctor over the counter and give them samples. Don't get me wrong, samples are really, really important. But on the other hand, you have to be relevant. Why are you visiting them? What information have you got for them that they may not have already read in their journals? Or is it that they want the clinical papers, that they need you to highlight the evidence and take them through the evidence of the drug? Or have you talked to them about the different patient profiles that of the patients they're seeing, and linking your drug into the benefits for those different patient profiles, and helping them make their life easier?
Mm-hmm.
I I can remember seeing doctors, and they were having like 30 patients lined up in the waiting room. They'd already seen 60 patients by about 2 o'clock in the afternoon.
Wow.
Some of them have exceptionally busy practices. And so to be able to get that door to open and get them to give you some time, they needed to feel that you were giving them what they wanted. Now, in some instances, some doctors actually just wanted a break from patients.
Yeah.
And so a rep was a break from a patient. And that might get your call rate up, but it certainly doesn't get you to where you need to be in your role. So it was also being able to reflect back on your day and prioritize who those doctors were that you saw that you believed that the two of you could make a difference to the end game, and not just seeing 13 doctors in a day because they wanted to have a chat with you. And hey, back in those days, I don't think we do it that much now, you could take morning tea like coffee and muffins, or lunch, or afternoon tea. I think lunches are still on the menu at the moment, but also too, FBT changed a lot of what we could do back then.
Fringe benefit tax.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, it was all about relevance to me. And there's nothing better, Ron, than actually having that relationship with a GP, as an example, or a specialist, and going back, and the first thing they say to you is, I tried that drug. I tried it on this patient or that patient, and hey, this is the success that I had with them. And once they've got that success, you can start to explore what other patients have you got that might be suitable for that particular drug, and working through some case studies there and who they might recommend the drug to from there on.
I mean, that picture of a general practitioner or a specialist, whatever, a doctor seeing 30, 40, 50, 60 patients in a day, is that a very typical, you've gone around to a lot of practices over the time.
You could see they were the hard ones to get into, and you'd have probably 30% of your territory might have been really busy practices,
Right.
but then there was also a lot of practices that you could just walk into quite easily.
Right.
And yes, it was great to see them, and great to be able to give them an update on the clinical evidence that was supporting the drugs that you were actually there to promote. But at the end of the day, you also want to be working with the people that have got a sizable practice that see a greater variety of patients that have got the opportunity to trial out the drugs.
And you mentioned, that you wouldn't sell anything you didn't believe in yourself. So presumably training was an important part of, because you didn't have that science or medicine background, and here you were, as a rep. What kind of training? Can you just kind of give us a bit of a snapshot behind the scenes of what kind of training you would go through as a rep before they'd send you out on the road, and how often that would
Yeah,
occur?
frequently. So if you think back to the first role I had, it was a 6-week training program. And despite the fact that a lot of the reps I was with had actually gone through, as an example, a science background, they still took you through the anatomy and physiology and the mechanisms of action of how the drugs worked, etc. And you had to pass all of those exams through the training program. But then there was the whole piece around the evidence and how the drugs actually work themselves. And it's combining that knowledge with the evidence that you're being presented with, and being able to have the right dialogue. So not only did it include recalling the information, but it was how can you actually describe it? How can you actually ask the right questions? Are you listening? And I really, if I had one thing I reflect back on, a lot of people will say to you, are you asking the right questions? That's really important. But to me, it was also about what were you hearing and what weren't you hearing? And being able to tap into that to be able to further the conversation with the doctor that you were seeing. So your training really involved a lot of the skills practice around having the conversations, being put in very sticky situations um, out of field so that you were ready when you got into field. Um, the other thing is, one of the companies I worked with, a lot of companies that are the bigger ones give you trade or presenters, that you've got a nice selling story and you can walk the doctor or the specialist or the pharmacist through your selling story. One of the companies I work with, we didn't have any at all.
What
And
does
if you
that
can
mean,
hit,
though? What did you said? What was that
it's
term?
like a 4-page sales aid.
Right, right.
So it had the story that you could ask the questions of who you were calling on, but then be able to quickly take them to the right information that answered the question that they may have had about that particular drug. One of the companies I worked with didn't have that. And I actually thought, on reflection in my time in this industry, that was probably the best training I ever had. And the reason being is you had to read the clinical data from front to back.
Right.
And so if you think of remember those old pilot bags or the pilots actually still have them. I had a bag full of clinical papers for the hospital cephalosporin that I had, and I would make sure that I reread again the content in those so that before I went in to see one of my customers, I already had in my head from the last time I called on them, where did we get to then? What have we agreed on? And where are we going? Where would I like to take them next on this journey? So that I already had those clinical papers at my fingertips. And if I needed to, I could pull them out and take them straight to the data that they required to help convince them that this was the right solution for their patients.
But with you, when you arrived, that 6-week sort of induction program familiarized you with anatomy and physiology and biochemistry and all those kind of sciences. And then a specific drug comes onto the market. And so would that involve a whole day program for you to be briefed on?
So the ongoing part of that is you generally work in cycles. So it might be a 3-month cycle, a 6-month cycle. So a company may have 2 or 3 drugs that you promote, and maybe for the first cycle, drug number 1's on promotion. So you spend a lot more time focusing on that particular drug. If a new one comes in, there's a whole launch around that. And they may, depending on the size of the drug, the potential market, the market it plays in, you might be brought into your head office for a week.
Right.
And you go back to step 1, you revisit all of the core information that you need to know, you delve really deeply into those clinical papers and go back through that same training. If you think about, top tennis players, Ron, they're continually doing the same basic core skills
Yep.
and fitness training. It's no different as a rep. You'd be brought in again and again and again. You go into the office back in those days every Friday. Sometimes that would be admin. Sometimes that would be 2 or 3 hours of skills training.
And typically, as a rep, how many doctors would you be visiting on a day? What would be a busy day?
A successful day would be 6 to 8 doctors. Now, quite often you brought in lunch, and that was the only time they had as a break. So in that instance, sometimes you'd see up to 6 to 8 doctors at that lunchtime. So it does vary, but the average call rate was around 6 to 8.
Right. So, and you mentioned you'd deliver samples. I mean, it probably wouldn't just be one bottle here, try this, but it would be several, so they could try that with many patients.
Yeah, it really depended on which product it was, but probably half a dozen.
And how does
It
that?
wasn't a huge amount. I do know other companies would give away boxes and boxes.
Right.
I don't think I can ever say I worked for an organization that was that generous.
And how does one measure success as a rep? I mean, is it the number of sales?
Look,
How does that? I mean, is it visits? The number of times you've got into the door, or obviously it's got to be related to sales.
um, the doctor can tell you that they can say, "Hey, I've recommended it," and you go, So you've got to ask them a few more questions so that they're telling you the story about the patient, what they recommended the drug for, and what that success was. That to me was the number one measure of success because they could really drill down into the patient type and the example. You could go next door to the pharmacy where the doctor resides, and you might have been selling the drugs into the pharmacy as well. And they quite often would say, "Oh, yes, I'll have 24 of that because Dr. Such and Such has been recommending that." And you'd think, okay, that's great. That's another measure of success in terms of what I've achieved. So it's more like a validation in that instance. But if you think about that now, back then you didn't have the chemist warehouses and the big discount pharmacies, so it was quite easy to track where how you were performing,
Mm.
I would suspect these days in that area that would be a little bit tougher.
Mm-hmm. And then you moved into, well, you were with Sanofi, and then moved to Pfizer, which is the name on everybody's lips. Everyone knows about Pfizer now, and but your roles changed there. You were more on the
So
education side of things,
I actually started at Warner Lambert,
right?
and Warner Lambert was bought out by Pfizer. And I have to say, a good chunk of the back end of my time in pharma was the continuation of merger, buyout, whatever. So
Yes.
I moved out of more of the GP specialist side, took a little bit of the break from the industry because I had my son. Then when I came back, that's when I went back into the the pharmacy side, and that was with Warner Lambert. So I took more of an office job because I wanted to work part-time. I wanted to be around when my son went to school, do all of the things that you want to do in their first year of kindergarten. And that then led and opened more doors. I went back into repping. Then I went into sales management. So one of the first jobs I had in management was heading up what we called the Z Force, because all of the products we had started with Z.
Mm-hmm.
And that was more of a national role. Played around in sales management for a while, but really knew that what I was passionate about was being able to train other people, take new people into the team, take them out on the road after they'd done their induction, and really work with them to coach and develop them. That's what I love, and that's what I still love today.
Mm.
And so that took me down the road of education. Pfizer was really good in that they created a national training role for me, which I was in, I think, for about 10 years, but I'd occasionally pop out of that, go in and do a regional manager's role or a national role and come back, or still keep the education side of it. And so that really grew and developed more from what was happening in the field, and then doing the induction training for the reps and then going back out in the field with them, to where we are now, which is a lot of stuff's done online.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so I think back in 2002 was the first time we started to look at how do you build some of this education online and make it really accessible to people, so you didn't have to bring them into Sydney or Melbourne for 6 weeks, that you could actually give them some of that basic training back home in the comfort of their own homes, but bring them in more for the practical application activities.
And when you were organising these events, or when you were actually sitting listening to these events as a rep, the people that you were listening to were, I guess, thought leaders in this field, doctors, professors, researchers who are coming in to report on what they have found. Is that kind of
There was
education?
more, not from what I was doing. Mine was more with the people. Um, what you're talking about is in that industry, there were a lot of conferences that were put on. So if the cardiologists were all coming in, they had their meeting once a year. That's when you went and listened to all the thought leaders and what the
Mm-hmm.
most recent research was. And that's where everyone got their education. As a pharma company, yes, you'd have a stand in the exhibition hall, but you'd also be going into the
Mm.
sessions and listening to what that latest research might be, or what was emerging in that field. The education I was providing was more around the product knowledge training, the selling skills training, that type of stuff.
Mm-hmm. And then, I mean, Pfizer and then Johnson and Johnson, a similar role at Johnson and Johnson in terms of education.
Yes, definitely. I think I was there for about 5 years after Johnson and Johnson bought out the division of Pfizer that I was in. So again, I stayed in the same company. I just kept moving.
Wow, I mean,
Didn't
that's
really,
such a feature of the pharmaceutical industry.
yeah.
I mean, in your time, where you've been from Sanofi to when you left the pharmaceutical industry, I mean, must have gone from many companies to really consolidated. Is that what's happened?
Yes, you could say it consolidated, but at the same time, Ron, when I first started, there were no companies that sold generics.
Uh-huh.
So where there were, let's say, and I don't know how many companies there were, but let's say there were 60. Yes, it shrunk a little bit, but then it grew because you have all of these organizations um, creating generics of all of the drugs that you've spent years promoting, and the companies you've worked for have poured millions and billions of dollars into research, not only researching and getting those products onto the market, but the research that brings us to where we are today and will take us to where we are tomorrow, and making sure that we've got drugs that are going to see and treat patients with the conditions they've got in the future, or solve the problems that we have today.
And when controversies come up within pharmaceutical companies, as they have done, I think Sanofi is interesting. I didn't realize Sanofi, because I know they had a drug called Depakine or Depakine. It was an epilepsy drug that caused all sorts of problems, and they get, there's fines issued and claims made against a company. How does that permeate through the company? How does people within the company become aware of that, or how do they even become aware of it?
Look, there's normally a first response uh, framework that people follow, and there's a division within the organisation that's there to deal with just that. But then there's really good frameworks put in place that ensures that the right communication goes to each and every person that touches the is customer facing, I'll call it, so that we know exactly what we're to say, how we're to respond. Maybe we don't respond. It just depends on what that scenario is, and the direction that the company gives you.
I imagine that as a rep and as someone involved in training reps and training you are really providing, particularly for busy practitioners, a lot of the knowledge for practitioners. They don't get a chance to get out there and learn, so they get an opportunity to learn from you. Is that your
Exactly right.
experience? Is that the experience you see?
Look, not every person will value that, but it's exactly why we're there. Because there's no way, even if I take the pharmacies today, some of those pharmacists can be dispensing 100 scripts a day, and they're still talking to their patients. They don't have time to sit there and go through everything they need to know about every drug, every interaction. Um, so they're relying on the really good reps to keep them abreast of what's going on. And sometimes it's not just on your class of product. It might be being able to draw um, correlations between other things that are going on in the market, and making sure that you are really giving them the gems that they need in a short period of time.
I know. I also thought I meant to ask you too, because when you were with Sanofi, you were dealing with a whole lot of range of products, and you were it. And then you said nowadays a company will have several reps dealing with a product. Have the number of reps increased over time?
No. So when I started, there were a lot of reps on a territory. So that's where the example of maybe there was 6. And I'll take Pfizer. I think there was 6 on every territory. In some instances, companies don't even play in that space anymore because it's gone up and it's come back down again. And they might be dealing more with the specialists, not so much the GPs. So the role and the number of reps has significantly decreased over the years.
Oh, okay. Is that because of why? Why? I'm surprised by that. Why would that be? More online stuff.
Look, I think the industry's changed. Like, even if I look back then, I'd organise loads of GP dinners, bring in specialists for the GPs
Oh, yeah.
to hear from, you, you know, key opinion leaders more in their territories. Sometimes you could bring in the overseas people, but more from a week-to-week basis. It was connecting an ophthalmologist with, I used to take an ophthalmologist from Newcastle as an example, and he would go to the different country towns and put on a talk or a workshop for an hour, and the GPs would have dinner while he was talking, and then they could connect.
But that ophthalmologist wasn't working.
That's changed a little bit now in terms of what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to
Right.
do. And there's a lot more rigor around what that looks like. And I think that may have had an impact on where we
Mm,
sit today. I think it really depends on what are the drugs. I think to a certain degree, maybe the generic companies have eroded opportunities a little bit because they're all Me Too's.
mhm,
And so really you need the drugs that you'd be needing to promote are the newest
mm,
ones and the ones that the doctors need the educating on.
mm.
Or same with the
So when
pharmacist.
you would organise, because I remember going to certain industry kind of dinners that were put on, was that, say, that ophthalmologist that you might have taken around? They weren't employees of the company. They would have just been
No,
people
no.
who had experience with the product.
They, I mean, you really had to understand who you were working with, make sure that they were great at being able to stand up in front of an audience. Not every, it's not what floats the boat of every specialist, let me tell you. Some can be brilliant at their craft, but they don't want to stand up and talk in front of GPs. Um, so you'd really be working with those who want to do that, but who are also well read in terms of what is the talk that they're going to bring to the table that's going to be relevant for the GP and help them understand more about that particular part of the industry that's going to help them back in their practice.
Mm. And what then you moved into the the big vitamin, and you can't get much bigger vitamin in Australia than Blackmores. Um, it's interesting. What are the differences? What are the similarities between these two industries? Because you've been right there at the cutting edge of getting these products into practitioners' hands. What is the difference and similarities?
Look, when I was in the first part of my career, I think it'd be fair to say a lot of people were quite skeptical about the vitamin industry. Did it really have a role to play? Is it just, you know, do they actually work?
Hmm.
That's what I should say. And I think what attracted me to Blackmores in the beginning was it still had Marcus at the helm,
This is
and
Marcus Blackmore.
Blackmore,
Yeah.
yeah. And he's been involved, or his father started it over 90 years ago. And there's a lot of history and heritage, and they've really driven the industry
Hmm.
in Australia for a number of years, and they have expanded out to Asia and China. Um, I learnt very quickly because I went there as a consultant for a learning management system project, not necessarily for an education project. But as part of that project, I had to become immersed in understanding more about the vitamin industry, and I started to read a lot more about each of the products. And really, they follow the same principle. They want the science based evidence that is put forward that helps them bring the products to market and then helps them put those products in the hands of, let's say, a pharmacist. And then the same concept, you've got reps that are going around and educating pharmacists and showing them the scientific evidence that supports the value of those products.
Hmm.
So they are actually quite similar, even though people would see them as different. You'd probably say the vitamin industry is not seen as being as big and aggressive,
Mm-hmm.
um, but it's not to say that there's no value there.
Hmm.
And, over time, again, when you start to talk to, in this instance, I don't go out and see the customers, but I have. Um, and I've talked to the people who do go out and see them and through the education programs that we provided. And it's still so many stories there where pharmacists have taken that leap of faith with those different vitamin products, recommended them to their patients, and have seen brilliant results.
Mm. Mm. I
So,
mean, I guess one of the biggest differences must be the patents, because patents must play a huge role. I mean, in the pharmaceutical industry, something comes online and is patented. This is obviously a more
yeah,
attractive thing. And once it comes off patent, well, it's not really, it's a generic drug now, so it's not really the same relevance Is that how it works? I mean, can you patent vitamins? I don't even think you can patent vitamins, can you? Or
I don't think we do, but I think what it is more around you don't necessarily have one active ingredient in a vitamin. It
formulations?
might be what's your patient type, what do they need in that vitamin, and how might we have done the research to bring 2 or 3 different active ingredients together to provide the solution for the particular patient types. So if you went into a pharmacy today, is every magnesium powder exactly the same?
Yeah.
Some yes, some no. Um, Same with the glucosamine products. It might be the grade of ingredient that's used sometimes, and that could happen in the pharma industry as well. The different grades of ingredients, you could have high quality, medium quality, low quality. And I can recall a time where in a particular drug class, some people were using the lower quality, some people were using the high quality. And when I mean low quality, the product would come out of the blister pack and fall apart.
Right.
But people would buy the cheap one because it was cheap, but it had the lower quality grade of active ingredient in it.
And in terms of regulation, are the both industries regulated in a similar way?
I think there's differences in the way they're regulated, but they play differently.
Oh,
It's really cutthroat in pharma. So you have to be, if you're promoting something about your drug, you need to have every T crossed and I dotted, because if you go slightly off claim, one of the other pharma companies will be all over you and you have to withdraw your promotion for that cycle, as an example. And that happened all the time. Whereas it certainly doesn't happen as anywhere near as much. In fact, I can't even say I've seen it happen maybe once since I've been at Blackmores. So they're 2 very
yeah.
different
I
industries
mean,
in
I
that way.
imagine the resources of the industry are very different as well. I
Mm,
mean,
yeah.
in the pharmaceutical, we're talking multi-billion-dollar industry. I think in vitamins, we're talking multi-million-dollar industry. I mean,
Oh,
or
it's
getting
getting
there,
there. I
getting there.
think you'd be very, very surprised. Like, even think about it, Ron. You walk into a pharmacy these days, how much of the front of shop space is dedicated to
Mm.
vitamins?
Oh, yeah,
And
huge.
and I think back to when I first worked at Pfizer, we had products like Codral, Benadryl, Sudafed, and they would be taking up the shelf space of what the vitamins are taking up now. Now they're that cold and flu space close to the back counter, but nowhere near the size of the vitamin space. They've almost most swapped shelf space.
So, Gil, knowing your whole journey through this at all sorts of different levels, when new drugs come onto the market, are you filled with excitement or caution, or how do you personally look at it, knowing all that goes on in both industries?
I think for me, like anything that's new, especially if you can solve a big issue in terms of healthcare today, that's exciting. But as I'm sure many people would do, the first thing you want to know is what's the evidence support that supports that, knowing that it's got to market in the majority of instances because it has been able to demonstrate that it is effective in the claims that it is making. And everything, as an example at Blackmores that we produce, we've got claims that we've had approved. And then we promote those products according to those claims. So you know here in your heart that the product has made it to market for the right reasons, and really it's up to you to it goes out into the market, and the market will tell you, do we want it? Don't we want it?
Mm, mm,
People will take it. Word of mouth is huge in the vitamin market. Hey, I've tried this. They tell their family, their friends, their cousins, their relatives. And we've got some products even in our stable at Blackmores which have got to where they are today because people have tried them, find them effective, and they will tell everybody.
mm. Oh, well, Gil, I really want to thank you. This has just been a little bit of a behind the scenes view of what goes on in these companies that we are all have contact with nowadays, one way or
Yep.
another. So thank you so much for today, and thank you so much for sharing that experience with us.
That's a pleasure, Ron. Thank you for having me.
So look, there it was. It was a snapshot. It was an insight into the workings at the ground level of sales in the pharmaceutical industry, and some of the challenges and some of the promotional educational materials and events that go on. It's a big subject, and for busy, time poor professionals, um, it's very clear that sales reps, whatever their level of expertise or background is, play an important role in educating doctors at the coalface. And for doctors that are time poor and run practices which might see 30 or 40 or 60 or 100 patients, I can't even imagine it, but seeing that many patients in a day, you are certainly time poor. And that's why the prescription pad forms such an important part of healthcare. If you're running a practice where you're seeing that, well, you do the maths. Even if you started at 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning and finished at 7 or 8 o'clock at night, fitting 100 patients in gives you probably around 5 or 10 minutes with a patient. And when you consider that every patient has a complex health history, a complex health story, and as a listener of this podcast, you will know how interconnected various aspects are, that you realise why the prescription pad plays such an important role in many doctors' practices. And I've often said in healthcare there are various models that you can use. One is a symptom-based model where a person comes in, say, with depression, and you're going to deal with that depression by prescribing an antidepressant. That may make it difficult for them to get to sleep, so you might prescribe something that allows them to get some sleep. All of those medications may interfere with their digestion. They may get heartburn, reflux, indigestion. So you would also then prescribe them with an antacid or a protein pump inhibitor like Nexium. That may then affect, and so the list goes on and on and on. And if you are running a symptom-based practice, then the prescription pad is your greatest friend. And if you have been advised about how to deal with each of those products by reps that have come into your practice and offered you simple solutions, and even better, given you samples of that, then that is one way of running a practice. And I would suggest that there are many, in fact, maybe even the majority of medical practices in the Western world run their practices like that. Another way of running a practice is to be finance-centred. There's been a recent story in Australia on cosmetic surgery, which is poorly regulated in Australia and is very profit-driven. So there is another example. Or if you have a skill, then you want to pursue that skill with the patient. And so perhaps upselling treatments that may not be in the patient's best interest is a financial centered practice. Another type of practice I think we've all experienced is a practitioner-centered practice, where you are just so honoured. You as a patient should be so honoured to be in this practitioner's presence, and so honoured to have this practitioner look after you. The practice model that I've used in my practice for over 40 years now, is what I refer to as a patient-centered practice, and that is, we need to make the patient the centre of that experience, and we need to find out what is best for that patient. And I think if you use as a practitioner, a simple mental trick, if you like, and that is, if I was sitting in the chair, if my wife, my daughter, my mother, or any relative or friend was sitting in the chair, knowing everything that I know, what would I want done? And that's a good model by which I think to practice. But actually, this is why the prescription pad has become such an important part of healthcare, and the management of chronic disease is arguably the way our health system works. And we may actually be seeing that play out. We are actually seeing that play out in our current pandemic. So I thought it was just an opportunity to share an insider's insight into that without being too controversial. I know we could have gone down many rabbit holes there, but I just really wanted to hear firsthand what went on. I hope you found that useful, informative. I hope this finds you well. Until next time, this is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. This podcast provides general information and discussion about medicine, health, and related subjects. The content is not intended and should not be construed as medical advice or as a substitute for care by a qualified medical practitioner. If you or any other person has a medical concern, he or she should consult with an appropriately qualified medical practitioner. Guests who speak in this podcast express their own opinions, experiences, and conclusions.